Imagine a city that runs on clean electricity.
A city that's powered by sun, wind,
and energy from the earth.
Con Edison is committed to turning that dream
into reality.
Making clean energy more accessible for everyone.
From South Brooklyn
to North Westchester,
Con Edison is helping build a future where there's clean energy for all.
Now and for generations to come.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Day 2 of the United Way of Westchester and Putnam's 2020 Nonprofit Leadership Summit. We hope, technologically speaking, it goes a little smoother than Day 1. If you were here with us yesterday, please accept my apologies for any inconvenience. I take full responsibility. My team and I have been working around the clock to diagnose and fix the problems from yesterday, much like we did in the weeks leading up to the event, and we are hopeful and confident that today's event will go smoothly. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Tom Gabrielle, the president and CEO of the United Way of Westchester and Putnam, and I'm delighted that you could join us today and hopefully all week long for this important capacity building event. If you were here yesterday for the kickoff of the summit, you saw Shirley Acevedo Bontempo, founder and CEO of Latino U College Access, conduct a Q&A session with our keynote speaker, Marco Davis, president and CEO of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus and Institute, and former deputy director of the White House Initiative on Educational Excellence for Hispanics. You also heard from our presenting sponsor, Stephen Maroney, senior vice president and regional manager at TD Bank. This is the 18th year we are hosting the Nonprofit Leadership Summit, which normally takes place in person in May and serves as an all-day conference dedicated to building professional excellence in the purpose-driven organizations of this community. Even though we had to reimagine the event this year as a virtual summit, our theme of diversity, equity, and inclusion is more relevant now than ever before. It is our fervent hope that this week's summit will in some small way help us all advance our missions, support our communities, strengthen our organizations, and help the arc of the universe bend a little more towards justice. Helping our communities, and for that matter, diversity, equity, and inclusion, is literally tied into the fabric of our name at the United Way, because we believe that we are stronger together and that it is only by being united that we can change the world for the better. Countless hours went into organizing and creating this week's Nonprofit Leadership Summit, and I'd like to thank my team here at the United Way for their tireless efforts. I'd also like to thank the dedication, vision, and support of our steering committee, made up of 30 nonprofit community leaders who shared their unique perspectives to make this event the best it can be. We can't thank each and every one of you enough. Here's a list of who they are. And of course, none of this happens without the generosity of our sponsors. Truly, their support enabled us to broaden the scope of this event while keeping it accessible to the widest possible audience. Here's a list of who they are.
So
now it is my great
here
pleasure
with everyone today, although not in person. I'm reaching out to all of you virtually, and it's great to be with you because you know what? This is always one of my favorite organizations to join with each year because it's because of all of you that are in the audience that our community is the way it is. During this unprecedented time, you have all stepped forward and done what is needed to be done to support our community. And I thank you for that. And I thank the United Way giving us this opportunity to all be together. This program that they have run now, that Con Edison has participated in for several years, is vital to keep all of us going and giving us the support that we need to in turn support our communities. You, as Con Edison, are like first responders. We are out there supporting our residents and customers. So on behalf of all of us here at Con Edison and everyone at United Way, thank you for everything you do and keep going. I'm sure we'll see each other soon on the other side of this, and I very much look forward to it.
That was Jane Solnick, Director of Corporate Affairs at Con Edison, one of our many major sponsors for this week's event. Thank you, Jane. Now let's get the summit started. It's my pleasure to introduce Maria Imperial, CEO of the YWCEA.
Thank you, Jane, and also Tom, Faith, and United Way for your leadership and support of nonprofits in Westchester and Putnam County. I am Maria Imperial, the CEO of the YWCA White Plains and Central Westchester, whose mission is eliminating racism, empowering women. Some people think of our mission as being two missions, but it really is only one. And it was a very prescient and timely mission. Years ago, the wise women of the YWCA realized that none of us could be empowered until all of us are empowered. And in order for all of us to be empowered, we must begin to address racism. Today, in alignment with our mission, I'm very excited to announce that the YWCA is planning to launch a Center for Racial Equity in January of 2021. We envision the center will be a hub, both as a physical and virtual space for anti-racism efforts in Westchester County. We would like everyone in Westchester to feel that they belong to the center and also to feel ownership of the initiative. I would like to send a shout out to Jan Fisher and NPW for being a planning partner, and also to the Anti-Racist Alliance in Westchester for advancing this work for so many years. After 2 years of organizing the DEI track for this summit, I am so thrilled that United Way decided to make diversity, equity, and inclusion the overall theme of the entire conference. Last year, one of the panels I organized highlighted the Building Movements Project's Race to Lead report and featured Frances Kunreuther, the co-director of Building Movement and a dear friend of mine for 25 years. Frances told me then that the person that we really should get to hear from is her co-director, Sean Thomas-Breitfeld, who is currently working on an update to the Race to Lead report, Race to Lead Revisited. I believe that a number of nonprofits in Westchester submitted follow-up data for the revised report. Isn't it great when things work out the way they should? And this year, I have the honor of introducing Sean Thomas-Breitfeld as today's keynote speaker. Sean co-directs the Building Movement Project and is also an adjunct assistant professor of public service at the NYU Wagner Graduate School of Public Service. There are 3 things that I think you should know about Sean, in addition to his passion for social justice. 1, he loves science fiction, pop culture, and dogs. 2, the silver lining for him from quarantine was taking hikes along the Hudson River with his husband and Frenchie. And 3, most importantly, Sean, like me, calls Yonkers home. As a CEO who is a woman of color, I must thank Sean and the Building Movement Project for their groundworking work. I never read anything so on point that captured my experience and the experience of so many other people of color in the nonprofit sector. I hope we can keep this conversation going. It's my pleasure to now turn over to Sean Thomas-Breitfeld. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Maria, for that wonderful introduction. It is great to be with all of you as a resident of Westchester, and also hearing about who else was a part of the conference so far. It's actually kind of amazing to be following Matko Davis, who is someone that I met very early in my career. My first job out of college was working at what was a national organization that was then called the National Council of La Raza. And Matko was there at the time leading a leadership development initiative. And, I think was one of the people who I think did really set me on a path in terms of my career and being able to have longevity and last in the nonprofit sector. I think as a person of color, it was really important to be in organizations that were led by people of color, and to have that be acknowledged and supported. And I think that that's really a key part of what we're trying to lift up through the Race to Lead work and research. And so to get us started, I'm going to start showing some slides. And as Maria mentioned, really what I'm going to be talking to you all about is the research through our Race to Lead initiative and the findings of our report, Race to Lead Revisited. And on the next slide, just to give you a little bit of context in terms of the basis for this research. So it's based on a set of surveys. So in 2016, BMP did a survey of nonprofit workers from across the country. And it was our first time trying to do a survey on this scale. And we were pleasantly surprised that more than 4,000 people across the country participated in the survey effort. We had actually set our goal at half of that. And when we hit 2,000 respondents after only 2 or 3 weeks, we thought, well, let's go for broke and try to have at least 4,000 people participate in the survey effort. And we met that goal as well in 2016. And I think it really just tapped into a hunger and need for people working in the nonprofit sector to really center these issues of race and unfortunately racial inequity that people were experiencing in nonprofit organizations. And so after a series of reports based on the data that we collected in 2016, last summer we surveyed the field again, and this time more than 5,000 nonprofit staff participated. And as you'll see on the next slide, the demographics of the over 5,000 survey respondents was distributed across the country. We did end up having respondents from every state in the country, but not surprisingly, larger shares of the sample were from big states like California, Texas, and New York. And some of the more rural states had less representation in the survey. But what was really striking, and you can see this on the next slide, was how consistent the samples were between 2016 and 2019. So in the survey, we asked people to self-identify as people of color or not. And so you can see that in 2016, 42% of the sample self-identified as a person of color, and you can then see the racial ethnic breakdown on the left. In 2019, 41% of the sample self-identified as people of color, and you can see the race breakdown on the set of bars on the right. And what's really striking between 2016 and 2019 was that everything's basically within 1 percentage point of the previous survey back in 2016. And that was then also true on the next slide in terms of gender and sexuality. So, as we know, the nonprofit sector has been a place where there's been much more opportunity and support for the leadership of women. And so it's not surprising that we see in 2019, 81% of the sample self-identifying as female. And then in terms of the LGBT identification, in both 2016 and 2019, 21% of the sample self-identified as LGBTQ. The big change and the big difference is on the next slide when it came to generation. So again, the samples were very consistent in a lot of the demographics between 2016 and 2019, but this was the one place that we saw some real shifting. And we think that this reflects what's actually happening in the sector and in the workforce. So we went from 38% of the sample reporting a birth year that would put them in the millennial or Generation Z generation back in the 2016 survey. And then in 2019, almost half of the respondents reported birth years within that age range. And so just to confirm that millennials are a large share of the workforce, the Pew Research Center and several other sources have also found that millennials have now become the largest share of the US workforce, and our data really does bear that out. So that's just to give you a little bit of background on the sample and who took the survey and what all of these conclusions are going to be based on. On the next slide, you can see the 3 key findings that we report on in the Race to Lead Revisited report. And so let's start with the first one, that is basically that the findings from 2016 were still true and relevant 3 years later. And so on the next slide, it just explains it in a little more detail. So this basic story of the Race to Lead report was that people of color were similarly qualified to be nonprofit leaders as their white peers. And the reason we really wanted to unpack that was that at the time when we were asking people, why are we seeing fewer people of color in top leadership roles, we heard a lot of explanations or explanations/excuses. And the data just didn't bear any of it out. So one of the things that we heard was that people of color were not as ready for those top jobs or didn't have the right set of qualifications. Well, our data showed that that wasn't the case, that people were similarly qualified, similar levels of educational attainment, things like that. Another thing that we heard was that people of color did not want these crazy nonprofit EV jobs. And while it's true that the job of leading a nonprofit organization often is crazy making, especially in these days, as you can see on the next slide, our findings were that people of color actually had a higher degree of aspiration to top levels of leadership in the nonprofit sector than white peers. And it was, again, very consistent between 2016 and 2019, although the gap was actually widening a little. So on the far left, you can see people who indicated they definitely or probably would want to be a top level leader in the nonprofit sector. And in 2019, 52% of people of color indicated yes, and 37% of white respondents said the same. Whereas, as you can see on the right side of this slide, a larger share of white respondents said that they definitely or probably did not want to be top leaders in the nonprofit sector and nonprofit organizations. And the reason this matters is that we have to really think about who the model is of a nonprofit leader, because there are all these ways in which people's biases end up leading them to ignore the potential of some people because they think, well, that person doesn't want to be a nonprofit leader anyway, so I'm going to focus my attention elsewhere. And we just felt like it was really important to lift up that there is an aspiration gap, but that the aspiration gap does suggest to the nonprofit sector that the leadership, that the people who want to be in leadership are more likely to be people of color than you would expect. On the next slide, we can see that despite the fact that there is this high degree of aspiration to advance in the nonprofit sector, that people of color often reported that their race had negatively impacted their advancement. And so the blue bars are, or the shades of blue show the data from people of color. The gold show the responses from white respondents. But in 2016, 7% of people of color said that their race had very negatively impacted their career advancement in the nonprofit sector, and 28% of people of color said that their race had slightly negatively impacted their career advancement. In 2019, that both measures had increased to 10% of people of color reporting very negative impacts and 39% of people of color reporting slightly negative impacts. And on the next slide, we just try to sum it up for you. So again, just if you take together very negative and slightly negative, actually, if you can just go back one slide. If you take together the very negative and slightly negative, in 2016, it was roughly a third of people of color reporting negative impacts of advancement, and it increased to half fully in 2019. And in terms of the awareness of white respondents about the potential for white privilege to be advantaging them in career advancement, half in 2016 reported that their race was having a positive impact, and that increased to 67%, 2/3 of the white sample. So on this next slide, you can see one of the write-in responses. And throughout this slide deck, I'll show you some quotes from people who participated in focus groups, who filled out the survey about the impact of these experiences in terms of their own lived experience. So this is someone writing about the danger of being labeled as an angry Latina and the challenge of knowing when and how to stand up versus holding back it or else being left out of decision-making circles. So these are the kinds of complicated decisions that many people of color report having to make as they're navigating some of these issues of race and inequality in the nonprofit sector. On the next slide, we see some additional challenges and frustrations that were reported. So for instance, everyone, regardless of race, reports that that our workloads are demanding in the nonprofit sector, but we saw increasing gaps between people of color and white when it came to people reporting inadequate salaries, when it came to people reporting few opportunities for advancement, and when it came to lack of role models. And so it's just really important for organizations to consider, even though everyone's workload is demanding, how can organizations really commit to ensuring that salaries are equitable, that the salary or pay disparities or pay inequities are minimized, that everyone in organizations has opportunities for advancement so we don't continue to see these almost 10 percentage point gaps between people of color and white respondents who are reporting that they are facing these challenges in terms of what it takes to advance in their organizations and sector. And then also this issue around lack of role models really being something that, we hear over and over again. Fortunately, as you can see on this next slide, there are people of color who do end up having role models. And what this really shows is how critical that kind of mentorship and support from other people of color is to people staying in the nonprofit sector. And this sense that without that kind of informal support, people would be actually pushed out of working in the nonprofit sector and doing work that really matters for their communities. And so that's a big part of why organizations need to be paying attention to these issues internally. The last slide in this section is about how people perceive these issues of the racial leadership gap and what they attribute them to. And so you can see at the top, one of the explanations that we tested was whether executive recruiters are part of the problem. And generally, people felt like, yes, that is part of the problem, that executive recruiters have a hard time or don't do enough work to find a diverse pool of candidates for top leadership jobs. But the gaps that we saw in 2016 generally were wider in 2019, with people of color agreeing with all of these explanations more than white respondents. I want to just draw our attention to the fourth one down, which was about people of color must demonstrate more skills and training than their white peers to be considered for top level positions. That was one where we saw a real large gap between people of color and white respondents. And I think what it reflects is an adage that I certainly heard from my parents around needing to be twice as good to get half as far. And it's really just unfortunate that so many people are having that experience over and over again in the nonprofit sector, and it's an injustice that needs to be addressed and corrected for in the sector and in organizations. So we're going to move on to the next main finding in the report that talks about what we call a white advantage. And so when we're talking about the white advantage, we're not just talking about white privilege as it's commonly thought of. That is certainly a factor in the nonprofit sector, as we saw with that slide showing whether people recognize that their race has had a positive impact on their career advancement in the nonprofit sector. But what we're also talking about when we talk about the white advantage is structurally who holds power in power positions in organizations carries with it some real advantages inside of the organization, and also very dramatically contrasting experiences between nonprofit employees based on race. And so on this next slide, just going to show a quote to get us started in thinking about how much the experience of frustration and isolation for people of color who end up navigating nonprofit spaces that are majority of white. That experience of being the one or one of only a few, and that it ultimately is an impact for the person themselves, right? So it impacts, as this person saying, their own professional and personal development, but also that it has a real impact on the running of the organization, the kinds of decisions that organizations make on whether to take a stand on issues in the community, what kinds of decisions get made in terms of budget allocation. So it's just something for all of us to be thinking about in terms of the effects of the concentration of power in nonprofit organizations that are particularly led with white leadership at the board and senior staff level. And so on this next slide, what you see is we asked respondents to basically provide some information about the organizations where they were currently working. And so what we were interested in was at all of these different levels, the board of director level, the staff and top leadership level, the staff not in top leadership roles, and then who is actually the constituency or community served. What was the sort of racial makeup of each of those groups? And you can see on the left side of this slide, when it comes to the board and staff and top leadership roles, majorities of all respondents reported that fewer than 25% of both of those categories were people of color, right? So that's, 75% or more often for organizations of the board is white, and 75% or more often of organizations' top leadership roles are held by white folks. In contrast, staff not in top leadership roles was much more distributed. And who the constituency and community served is weighted on the side of majority people of color. And so what this data also shows is that there's often a real mismatch between who the organizations are serving and who are leading the organizations, who are making the decisions about the future of the organization, which often is the board and staff and top leadership roles. And so we combined the data on boards of directors with the data on staff and top leadership roles to create some categories to group organizations into. And that's what we tried to show on this next slide. And so what you can see in the grid on the left is that if you take those two sets of data, you end up with 4 categories. By 4 categories, ultimately 16 little boxes. And it's pretty striking that 45% of all respondents reported working for an organization where less than 25% of the board are people of color, and less than 25% of the top leadership team, staff leadership of the organization, are people of color. And given, again, that is 1 out of 16 possible combinations, that it's so weighted in that direction, I think really does show the whiteness of organizations. And that's the orange box at the top. In contrast, we created a category of POC-led organizations that was for the roughly 14% of respondents who reported that at least 50% of the board and at least 50% of the staff leaders in the organization were people of color. And so the grid on the right side shows the 45, 41%, and 14% as a sort of distribution of in reality, as opposed to what you would have expected given those sort of 16 boxes in the grid that were possible. So it's just a way to try to visualize this finding around like the whiteness in terms of who holds power in organizations, but it ended up having real impacts when we looked at questions that are on this next slide, like whether people feel like they would be happy if they worked at the organization 3 years from now, whether people feel they have a voice in their organization, whether people feel that their organization offers fair and equitable opportunities for advancement and promotion. And so what we're showing here is the gaps between people of color and white respondents based on which kind of organization they work for, whether it's a white-run organization where 75% or more of both the board and leadership, staff leadership are white, or at the bottom, whether they work for a POC-led organization where over half of the board and staff leaders are people of color. And you can see that the gaps get much smaller between white respondents and people of color when they work for POC-led organizations. But when people are working for white-run organizations, people of color report much more negative or less likely to agree with each of these statements, right? So if the statement is on this next slide, I would be happy if I worked at this organization 3 years from now. You can see that we had a scale from 1 to 10, 10 being completely agree with that statement, right? And for people of color working for white-run organizations, their average was only a 5.4 out of 10. So if you think of that as like a sort of grade, that is like a 54%, not necessarily a passing grade in terms of people of color working for white-run organizations, whether they'd be happy working at the organization 3 years from now. So I think this question around retention is a very live one when it comes to people of color working for white-run organizations. In contrast, though, 7.1 was the average rating for white respondents working for white-run organizations. For people working in this all other combinations group, the both scores increased, right? So you see 6.6 is the rating for people of color working in those types of organizations. 7.7 is the rating for whites working in those organizations. And then at the bottom, people working for POC-led organizations, both white respondents and people of color gave their organizations a rating of 7.5. So it's both no racial gap and also higher rating than we saw for people working for white-run organizations. On the next slide, we focus in on whether people feel like they have a voice in their organization, and the same pattern happens. So the gap decreases, the racial gap decreases, and in this case, we actually see people of color rating their organizations higher than white respondents if they work for a POC-led organizations on that sense of whether they feel they have a voice. On the next slide, it's just showing whether people feel like their organization offers fair and equitable opportunities for advancement. And so again, the gap decreases and the mean moves up the scale closer to the positive end as when people are working for POC-led organizations. And so on this next slide, you can see one of the responses again around like, what is that experience being a person of color in a white-run organization, feeling like you're not taken seriously, feeling like questioning things is not appreciated, feeling like you're being used as a token. All of those kinds of negative experiences were the sorts of things that we heard over and over again in, unfortunately, these write-in responses as well as in focus groups. So I'm going to move us on to the third main finding, which related to DEI initiatives. And what we were interested in with the 2019 survey was we just were acknowledging that, when we had collected the survey data back in 2016, people were talking about race equity and diversity, equity, and inclusion was becoming sort of more of a buzzword, but it wasn't as ubiquitous as it is now. And so in 2019, we wanted to sort of assess, hear from people, like, how are they actually experiencing DEI initiatives in their organizations? And one thing that was encouraging was that basically 3/4 of all respondents work for organizations that are doing something, which is good. Unfortunately, the perception of the impact of those efforts is very mixed, and that's what I'll show you with this next set of slides. So on the next slide, you can see some of the DEI strategies that people reported their organizations were doing and what the racial difference was between people of color respondents and white respondents. So are organizations providing training for staff, leadership, and board? Absolutely. We saw that was the top strategy that was reported by white respondents on the part of their organizations. Clarifying that DEI is central to the organization's purpose and reflected in the mission statement. Again, high rating in terms of people saying that that's something that their organization are doing, and also one where we weren't seeing much of a racial gap between people of color and whites. Addressing ways that racial inequity and systemic bias are impacting the issues that organizations work on, another great thing for organizations to be doing. And then increasing representation on board and advisory committees. Just interesting to see that there was a gap that emerged again, with people of color being less likely to report that that was a strategy that they saw their organizations pursuing. So on that first strategy around training, on this next slide, what you can see is we asked people if their organization had done training, what training topics their organization had done DEI training on, and whether they felt like the training had a positive impact on their organization in terms of becoming a more equitable workplace. And so you can see on the right side just the percentages of respondents who reported each of these training topics. And I just think it's worth noting that understanding terms, understanding implicit bias, understanding structural racism, understanding white privilege, like the sort of conceptual topics are top training topics that we saw much higher reporting by respondents. In contrast, recruiting a diverse staff was lower, which I think is interesting and I think worth us considering as a sector. I think there are ways that a training on implicit bias ultimately does lead into organizations rethinking their recruitment strategies. But if part of what we are going to do is not just change mindsets, but actually change who holds positions of power in organizations, that becomes the issue of recruitment as well. It becomes an issue of changing who holds power and how organizations share power among leadership teams, all of those sorts of things. And so it's just worth us thinking about, like, what are the topics that organizations are gravitating to, and how might we also help organizations engage on training topics that might push them to think more about some of the structural changes inside of their organizations. The other thing that we wanted to show with this slide was that we asked people whether they felt like the trainings had a positive impact. And one thing that was striking was that if people reported that their organization had done training on 4 or more topics, they were much more likely to feel that the trainings had a positive impact, and particularly that rate the training impact as very positive. And so that's what you see in the contrast between the circle for 3 or fewer training topics and 4 or more training topics. And what I think this says to organizations is that a one-time training is not going to do it, right? I think that one of the things that we heard, particularly in focus groups, was a frustration that organizations have been doing training as sort of a checkoff, as a compliance measure, and that there's a sense that organizations need to do much more robust and involved training that involves a variety of different topics, that is sustained over time. And those kinds of commitments to ongoing engagement and training on these topics leads to people feeling that they are more impactful. On this next slide, you can see one of the write-in responses around the positive impact of training, but again, that the organization had to provide funding for it. And so I'll just read the quote since it's not coming up on the screen, but it's by an Asian woman survey respondent. I have been fortunate that my organization was provided funding for equity training. The trainers helped the group identify many of the structural and systemic inequities in our organization's structure and culture. To have been part of this transformation, it takes love, patience, diplomacy, anger, and dogged persistence. And that's an interesting combination of elements to have in the mix, right? Love, patience, diplomacy, but also anger and dogged persistence. All of that is really what it's going to take for organizations to really move towards becoming more equitable workplaces. On the next slide, you can see that we also asked people whether their organizations have policies and commitments around DEI. And again, not surprisingly, we saw the same pattern that I showed you earlier, where we see larger racial gaps between respondents working for white-run organizations, and those gaps are smaller, if not completely disappear, for respondents working for POC-led groups. But it's just worth, as organizational leaders, thinking about whether your organization has policies and procedures in place to ensure diversity, equity, inclusion, whether the leadership is consistently demonstrating that commitment. And this last one, I think, has been particularly important in the last several months, whether the organization takes a public stand on the root causes. And so I'm going to move on to the next slide. And so this is the set of recommendations that were in the Race to Lead Revisited page. And I'm just going to ask us to go to the next slide just because it's a little more readable on the next page. But so the first one, in terms of what it's actually going to take for organizations to make change, have to pay attention to the experience of people of color in the workplace. We also think that it's really important to ensure that policies reflect the commitment and that organizations are acting on those policies in a way that is consistent. One of the things that we've been building a race equity assessment for organizations as part of the pilot testing of it. One of the things that's been really interesting is, sometimes the question is, do people know that a policy is on the books? Other times, the sort of fundamental question is, do people believe that the policy is being used, that the policy is being lived up to? And so that's really comes to a question around leadership and management. We also think that, particularly given the way money and resources flow in the nonprofit sector, that funders have a particular responsibility to this work. And that funders need to commit to supporting groups that are led by people of color. Not sure if people had a chance to read some of the other research by groups like ABFI. There's also a report out from Echoing Green earlier this year. But it's become very clear to many of us that there is this term that's now being used, philanthropic redlining, that's happened in the sector that has led to many organizations that are led by people of color being small, constrained because they lack access to funding and resources. And then because they have lacked access to funding and resources in the past, they can't get big enough to then get new grants from funders who want to make different kinds of investment. And so there's just a real shifts that are going to be needed, particularly at the level of philanthropic support for organizations to ensure that more diverse organizations are able to survive in these times and much less be able to thrive. We also think that when it comes to what it's going to take to make change, this fourth element, that organizations have to set some racial equity goals that are focused on actual demographics and composition of their organization and to better reflect the population that's being served. That racial mismatch between who's making decisions about the future of organizations and who the constituency that organizations are serving is something that many organizations really need to reckon with and confront so that they can make some structural changes. And then the last element in terms of what it's going to take to make change, and this is, again, part of why we've been working so hard to try to build a race equity assessment. I just think organizations have to be transparent about and committed to tracking progress, and be willing to do course corrections and figure out how to shift resources, shift their commitments to really live into what it's going to take for nonprofit organizations to be more racially equitable workplaces. So moving into sort of the wrap up, we just want to think a little about the perceptions of the sector broadly. And so we asked respondents whether they agreed with a set of statements. And so it was interesting to see some of the differences. And so just want to point out that in general, respondents agree that it is a problem that the leadership of the sector doesn't reflect or represent the diversity of the country. However, it was interesting to see such a big difference of opinion on this statement of whether we know how to improve DEI, but decision makers lack the will. People of color generally agreed with that, and just under half of white respondents agreed with that statement. On this next slide, you can see a quote that really speaks to the point about knowing what it would take to make change, but lacking the will to actually make change. So this is a survey respondent saying that we can readily identify barriers, and what we have to do is shift the focus to actually changing people's behaviors. And some of those behaviors have to do with who gets recruited to serve in board leadership roles, who gets recruited or hired for top jobs in organizations. Like, actual behavior change is what's going to really make the difference. On this next slide, we just wanted to test out and show what were some of the sectoral strategies for change that we wanted to test out with people. And so I think that part of the reason that we wanted to show this difference between respondents overall and EDs, CEOs in particular, was because, generally there's a lot of agreement that white leaders have to advocate for race equity and against bias, that leadership development programs for people of color are important, and that diversifying the composition of boards is important. Where we saw a difference of opinion had to do with whether or not philanthropy increasing funding to organizations led by people of color would make a difference in the sector. And that's where we saw the biggest gap, and it was particularly big among EDs and CEOs. And I think this is where we start to think about the questions of, what it would actually cost leaders and organizations for change to happen at scale across the sector. And so, when it comes to issues of funding, philanthropic investment, these are the difficult discussions that are going to be needed in the nonprofit sector for there to really be more equity, more equity in nonprofit organizations and across the nonprofit sector. So with that, I'm going to open it up to Q&A. Last slide just shows my organization's website. We have the Building Movement Project has a website for all of the work that we do. And you can sign up for our mailing list there to get more information. If you're just interested in downloading the Race to Lead reports, there have been a ton of reports between 2016 and 2019. All of those are available at www.racetolead.org. Thanks again for having me for this keynote, and I'm really excited to have this Q&A and engage in discussion with you all.
Thank you so much, Sean. Thank you for sharing all of that information, which still astounds us all. From reading some of the chats that people were posting, we can't thank you enough for illuminating this important subject. So there are a couple of questions. The first, I'm gonna ask myself. So as a white male cisgender CEO of a nonprofit organization, besides being an ally and a mentor and recruiting BIPOC and LGBTQ individuals, what's the most important thing that I can do to help increase representation for other populations at the leadership level?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the recruitment decisions that organizational leaders make are critical. I also think that the recruitment decisions that organizational leaders make with an eye towards the future of the organization and a plan for what kind of team would need to be in place for a successor to not have to look exactly like the existing ED is also really important. One of the things that I keep hearing from leaders of color, so I don't think this is surprising, but basically like 90% of white EDs, CEOs report that they followed a white ED, but only half of people of color report that they followed ED who was also a person of color. And so oftentimes executive transitions are also racial transitions. And for the incoming leader to not have to look or be exactly like the exiting leader, there's a lot of work that existing white leaders of organizations have to do to build up a team that will be supportive, a board that will be supportive, and also funder relationships that will stick with the organization even after the leader leaves. And I know that a lot of us as executive leaders are sort of moving on as many years off in the future, but that's part of why having this long view is really important, because the kind of cultural change that it takes in terms of the staff team, the board, and then also the relationships with funders takes more than what's usually the horizon when an organization is thinking about an executive transition. And so that's why I think the recruitment is really important at both the staff leadership levels as well as the board levels. And then, I think having some difficult, challenging conversations with funders is also really important.
Thank you, Sean. Another question in the chat was, recently California instituted legislation to ensure diversity on the boards of directors of for-profit organizations. Do you believe that that should be replicated, A, everywhere, not just in California, but B, specifically in nonprofit organizations to ensure that boards are more reflective of the communities they serve?
I think it's an idea worth considering and looking at. I think that one of the reasons that many nonprofits have boards of directors that are so white, and as we know from data that BoardSource has collected, I think it was something like 90% of boards were mostly white based on their data. I think part of the reason for that is that organizations are looking for their board to often fill a fundraising role. And given the racial wealth gap in this country, it then makes it logical for organizational leaders to try to recruit rich people to be on the board, and rich people are more likely to be white, right? And the people of color who are rich are already probably being tapped to serve on multiple boards and things like that. So, I think that part of the challenge is, what's the fundamental role that we think boards of directors need to play in the sector? For organizations that see their board as a measure of accountability, a way of ensuring connection and representation of the community, those are the organizations that have people of color on their boards. For organizations that are relying on their boards to, bring in their wealthy friends for fundraising events, unless there's a way that sort of fundamental financial equation changes, I think it's going to be really hard for many organizations to move towards having more diversity on their boards, which again brings up the question around how money moves and operates in the nonprofit sector. The other thing that I just want to bring up as it relates to California, so I think it was probably a decade or more ago, there was actually a legislative fight that was going to ask California foundations to publicly report on the demographics of their own organization and board, as well as the racial demographics of their grantees. And it was a proposal that came out of some research that nonprofit organizations had done to demonstrate that white-led organizations were getting bigger grants than organizations led by people of color. And so, what part of why we were really interested in this and what led to us doing a report on the data we collected from California back in 2016 was that what foundations did, sort of in exchange for that policy not actually moving forward in the state legislature, was they voluntarily made some commitments to increase their investments in organizations led by people of color and in capacity building for organizations and for nonprofit leaders of color. And it's possible that did make a difference. We couldn't conclude from the data that was in fact what happened, but anecdotally, we were hearing that the massive influx in investment in both organizations led by people of color and capacity building for nonprofit employees of color had made a difference for many people who had been working in the sector for years. And so I think there are multiple ways of using the pressure or putting the pressure on stakeholders. And so whether the boards are the stakeholder that we need to put pressure on, or whether the funders are the stakeholder that we need to put pressure on legislatively, I think we probably need both. But I think that in terms of particularly right now with COVID and the worries of so many organizations around maybe not this fiscal year, but next fiscal year, it seems to me that shoring up funding and directing resources is going to be particularly key.
Thank you, Sean. Another question, which I guess is more of a comment than a question, but it is timely. You probably heard of the Wells Fargo CEO made a comment during a Zoom meeting this summer that the bank had trouble reaching diversity goals because, quote, there was not enough qualified minority talent. I was wondering what your opinion was on the subject.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know much about the banking or financial sector workforce, but I can say that for the nonprofit sector, I think that there are some easy excuses that organizations go for, and I think that there are real limitations that organizations may face depending on the demographics of their local area. I think that part of the question for organizations is what would make their organization appealing to a more diverse workforce? Because I think oftentimes the sort of assumption is that, well, of course anyone would want to work here for this organization, but there's research that has shown that, and this is not specific to the nonprofit sector, but general recruitment research, that the who is pictured like on an organizational website, but also that in combination with whether the organization has a statement around being welcoming, valuing of diversity, both of those things are more likely to sort of indicate to potential applicants of color that they should consider applying. I think people of color don't often want to be the one or one of a few in an organizational context. And so that creates some real challenges and limitations for organizations that are currently majority or overwhelmingly white. And so I don't want to minimize that is the case, but I think it's less often about the qualifications of people of color and more about whether the organization is an organization that is appealing to enough of the people of color who would be qualified and open to filling those kinds of roles.
Thank you. There's two more questions in the chat. I'll get to them quickly unless anyone else has anything else that they want to share or ask. How do you see the regulating of funders to avoid redlining?
It's a great question. Excuse me. I think funders have been not necessarily easy to regulate. And I do think that as more foundations, though, have been collecting data on the demographics of their grantees, I think it's incumbent on those funders to demonstrate to grantees that they're actually doing something with that information, and that funders are taking a critical look at their portfolios to assess both overall, like what are the demographics of the organizations that they're investing in. Also, what might there be in terms of disparities in funding to organizations based on race. And I was actually just exchanging some emails back and forth with one of our funders who was asking, well, is there a standardized definition across funders for what counts as a POC-led organization or an organization with sufficient BIPOC leadership? And I don't think that there is. We created the 3 organization types because we wanted to think beyond just the ED of the organization and think about the team holding leadership and decision-making power in organizations. That's why we looked at both the board and the leadership team. I think some funders just decide based on whether the ED or CEO or co-director of the organization is a person of color, which is a legitimate way to look at it. It's a very simple sort of binary yes/no categorization, which may be sufficient for some places. I think other funders do collect enough data that they could really look at the composition of the board and the composition of the senior team, inclusive of and possibly beyond who is the ED of the organization. And so I think as a philanthropic sector, I think that there needs to be both more sort of clarity and commitment across philanthropic organizations that they're going to take these issues seriously and try to address the historic redlining that has happened in terms of POC-led organizations not getting access. And I also think that there just needs to be more funders who will make affirmative commitments to increase their investment in organizations that are led by people of color, regardless of whether those budgets are smaller, and that therefore means that the grant is a bigger proportion of the overall budget of the organization. Like, there are all of these additional rules when it comes to philanthropy that I think end up ruling out organizations that are led by people of color that are on their face or on the surface not fundamentally about race.
Great. And final question. Can you tell us what's next for the Race to Lead survey?
Sure. We have put out a range of sort of smaller Race to Lead briefs since the Race to Lead Revisited report came out that have looked at the data in particular cities or states. And so we initially took a geographic focus. We're looking ahead to the possibility of, drilling down on some of the generational differences that we started to see come out in the data as well as in the focus groups. So there will probably be some topical reports as well to drill down on specific ways of sort of disaggregating, whether it's a combination of race and gender, EDs of color, that sort of thing. I think the bigger thing for BMP is the effort to build this race equity assessment, which, many of the questions that I showed you, particularly the ones where we're asking respondents to sort of rate their organization on a scale from 1 to 10, are questions that we developed for this race equity assessment that we had been pilot testing last year. We've continued to beta test it this year with cohorts to, just try to get to a place where, we're at a place where the survey itself is set, but the way that we analyze the data and put it into a customized report for the organization still needs a little bit of work and ultimately needs to be automated for it to reach scale. But the hope is that it will reach scale, and we'll be able to fully launch it next year. And it will make it possible for organizations to get their staff to fill out the survey. We'll then aggregate the data from their staff so that we get a picture of how staff are viewing and experiencing the organization. We'll be able to reflect that to the organization through a customized report that provides some analysis based on 4 key competencies. And those competencies are leadership, because we think it really matters. The leadership is committed and demonstrates that commitment. That the organization is responsive, that the organization is in a learning mode. That becomes really important for organizations, because if they're really rigid, they often are very resistant to making change that is required to become a more equitable workplace. The third competency relates to relationships and the ability of an organization to have, more difficult conversations, because that's often really necessary when it comes to, race equity. Talking about race is often not an easy thing for organizations to do. And it requires the ability to have difficult conversations, but also to maintain relationships while doing that. And the last competency relates to voice and power, because we think it really matters whether people feel like they have voice in the organization and who holds positions of power in the organization, that the organization is taking that seriously. That's another competency that we think is really key to organizations being able to do more race equity work and to become more equitable workplaces. So we're working hard on building that and looking forward to being able to release it next year, and hope to have some analysis across the sector based on how organizations are doing.
Awesome. Well, Sean, we can't thank you enough for this important research, for your time and your graciousness in being a part of this event. I know neither of us imagined when we first spoke back at the end of last year about you participating as one of the keynote speakers for our summit, that it would be virtually. But we certainly appreciate you sticking with us and working with us and continuing to be a part of this event and sharing the important data that you have for all of us to think about in the nonprofit community. So I want to thank everyone again for being a part of today's Nonprofit Leadership Summit session. I want to thank our steering committee, our sponsors, of course, the team here at the United Way. We truly hope that you found value in Sean's presentation and from hearing from Maria Imperial at the YWCA about what they're doing for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we hope you'll be here tomorrow for Kishana Palmer, CFRE. She's a nonprofit consultant, coach, fundraiser, author, blogger. That's a lot of slashes for The Secret Lives of Leaders. And she will speak about promoting diversity in your marketing and fundraising efforts. There's still time to register for the rest of this week's summit, so make sure to tell your friends, colleagues, and associates. Thank you again. Have a great day, everyone, and stay safe. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thank you.
Expected is waiting around for your bank to send you a debit card in the mail. Unexpected is ordering a replacement debit card on your TD Bank app that you can pick up curbside the same day. Because we know your car is your sanctuary.
Peace. Tranquility.
Thank you so much. It just kind of relaxes me, so.
You're welcome, Jeff.
Curbside debit card replacement. TD Bank. Unexpectedly human.